Hi, welcome to Holistic Inquiry, writing poems to listen, ask, and learn. We are at the second half of our workshop and talk. I am Collie Fulford, Nan Molyneux, Adam Rosenblatt, and you'll be hearing from Nan first about how she uses holistic inquiry. Um, our sponsors are Duke University, Humanities Unbounded, Franklin Humanities Institute, and at North Carolina Central University, the Department of Language and Literature.
Okay, just making sure I'm unmuted. So I'm going to pretty much share, although I use poetry both in my own research and writing and in the classroom, I'm going to focus on just a few of the ways that I brought it into the classroom. I didn't know it was called Poetic Inquiry when I started to bring it in. It actually generated from writing classes that I was teaching, academic writing seminars, where I'm supposed to be training students to do academic research and argument evidence-based essays. And I would open the class with, what kind of writing do you like? They never said academic essays. I think I had one in dozens and dozens of classes, one student. But more people than I expected said, you know, I like creative writing. I dabble with it. I do this or that. And many more than I expected did some form of poetry. So bringing that more and more into the writing, academic writing classes, finding out that good writing is good writing. Exploring with words is exploring with words. And you can start with creative writing and you can bridge to academic, gave me the courage to actually say, I wonder if I can bring creative writing into my history classroom. So there are a lot of concerns. And if there are any historians in the room, you may know that historians have probably more resistance to bringing creative writing in than other disciplines. Well, we don't want to get subjective. We don't want to have a subjective reaction to documents, to anything we're analyzing. We're supposed to be objective. And that's true, of course, not just in social science. We're supposed to be looking at evidence and evidence-based arguments and evidence-based conclusions. And again, what place do feelings have there? What place does my experience have there? I don't want to bring my experience in. Are you kidding? I have all this to cover and I am going to spend a class or part of a class letting my students write poems. And the big one for this historian anyway, I'm not a poet. I'm not even an English teacher. I don't even know good grammar. What do I know about poetry? But I jumped in anyway. And what I found, this is just a little bit of what I found, was the experience of the students and my experience with them was immediately there was greater engagement and commitment to whatever they were looking at, and they were more involved. And what was really interesting is that poetry seems to act like a camera that can both zoom into detail and have you, like I just was scanning, and I hope we have time at the end for you to scan some of the generated poems that came out of that portrait. And one was just on the fan that was being held. So the ability for the camera to zoom in and pick out details and subtleties in sources that if you're just going in saying, okay, I have to analyze this, you might not have the time and space to say, look at that fan. What's that fan about? I know what it's about in my culture. What was it about in this culture? And at the same time, poetry seems to allow you to back up, to pan out. And I was noticing that my students were on their own questioning, what's the context to this? As some people were doing in their poems. Wait a minute, why are we even painting a picture of children? What's going on? What's the bigger, where are they going to? Where are they coming from? Rather than more subjective bias, my experience was, and I experienced this also as a researcher and writer, is that once I'm given, and my students are given, a place to show up as myself with my reactions and my relationship. I am open to other perspectives. I'm curious about other perspectives. So I noticed much more. I didn't have to nurture and kind of pull from my students, what do you think it looks like from this perspective? You know, a different race, a different class, a different gender. I didn't have to. The students themselves were asking those questions. And their questions were so much more interesting and nuanced, and that continued through. Again, usually before I used poetic inquiry or other types of creative writing with analysis, my students would go to the first question they could think of, the first conclusion, and it was something that sounded intelligent and that would please me. When I used this technique, they forgot about me for a while. Hallelujah. They forgot about that they would be graded for a second, for a nanosecond. That is just such a relief to the uncomfortable power dynamic that's in the classroom. So overall, what I was noticing was that a personal connection was leading to this closer reading, listening, and more than anything, curiosity, greater curiosity. So here's this same assignment that I told you. Well, I just shaped it a bit for you, but this is an assignment that I used for years before I had them write a poem. And this is the same portrait, and they would know just what was on, you know, the curatorial card that's in the museum. And I would ask them, and I'll just give you a couple of examples, but I'll tell you, a couple of them really remind me of some of yours, which is so interesting. And here's one. And this was a freshman in a history class, and this was history of childhood in America. Who's watching? It isn't just the accessories, the clothes, the stance, defying childhood play, telling me how soon he'll manage the firm, the immediacy of the little girl's marriage banns. So he's doing a nice job initially of noticing, but he almost pushes that out of the way to make more of a connection of what's bothering him. Something is affecting him emotionally. It's the eyes on the future, on tomorrow, and those two staring straight at me. And a few of you wrote about eyes as well. Is she reprimanding me for peeping into her parlor? Who or what doesn't she want me to see? And you can see he's catapulted into questions without any prompt from me. Who stands behind the easel managing the mood and movement? Who is Anna's, that's the middle child, somber gaze fixed upon? If I look closely enough, can I see the hidden part of the scene mirrored in her round black eyes? Can I paint a portrait of the other end of the room? So after some playing and discussion, he realized he really wanted to write on what's going on that we can't see. Is there a parent there? Is the artist? And he started a research project on the relationship between parent, artist, and child. Which again is a much more interesting question than normally came out of my classes. And just for contrast, and this really reminds me, I think it might be Jess, but one of our poets, the youngest girl, third on the left, to the side, not quite enough canvas, after haughty prince and rebellious princess, the quiet one, forgettable and hardly singular, just a copy of her sister, one hand empty, and the other holding all that is perishable. And that last line is an example of that detail. I used this portrait for years before I realized there's only one thing that's perishable that they're holding, and that's in the youngest. And so she asked a question that there was very little literature on, which is a good thing if you want to get published. What were the prospects for a youngest daughter in these families that painted these portraits? And there was so much on younger sons, and there was almost nothing on youngest daughters. So just a couple other quick examples of how then I'll just refer to ways, the myriad of ways you can use both found and generative poetry. Let's say you've done some of this initial work, you've come out with a beginning argument or hypothesis. I know what I want to say here. One of the things I have my students do is I have them go back to the text and do a found poem on words they didn't notice. And these 4 words are from an example that I was having students examine the theatrical reviews of some African-American performers from the 19th century. And this one student was looking at reviews of an African-American singer, and her first reaction was, I don't see anything blatantly racist here. And she was on her way to crafting an argument that this is amazing. In the arts, we actually have, an absence of overt racism. When she did her found poem, she found that this singer's body was referred to as stout, masculine, square-built, and solid. And if you know anything about 19th century female gender body ideals, it is not these words. It probably is still not these words, gender ideals for women. And she was able to rethink. The found poem allowed her to rethink, wait a minute, the racism is coming through a door I didn't see, that people at the time would read. And just to hop to 2 other quick examples, I teach at Duke Kunshan University, or I used to, which is Duke's joint venture university outside of Shanghai, China. And one of the mission statements of that university, and especially of the writing classes, is to encourage cross-cultural discussion. And so this was, again, looking at documents, and this was an assignment that had students last January and February looking at how the media from their home country was portraying early COVID reporting on the COVID cases. And a student generated this poem reading some of the early articles. My breath quickens at the news, but is this the immoral press squeezing my heart, heralding my doom? And I and several other students said, what do you mean by immoral press? And this student was Chinese national. And she said, well, where you can't trust the press. And some of the other students who English first language said, I think, do you mean unreliable? And it just catapulted us into this really rich discussion about why would we use immoral or not use immoral in the States? And you might use immoral and mean the same as unreliable. And it got us talking about religion and Christianity and the influences on language. And this is something that I find somehow, not as an English teacher, very challenging to sometimes get the discussion down to the granular level of what's in that word. And in these days when we're talking also about microaggressions, and sometimes it's in a word. And so found poetry can be an incredible vehicle for getting down to that granular level, whether you're exploring language across cultures or across any divide. And then last but not least, I teach 19th century US history, and just like any era of history, and actually I think any of the courses that are taught by the people sitting here, there are a lot of difficult topics, upsetting documents. I find that poetry makes space. It's a pause. And I'll just share a quick story. When I was in graduate school and I was taking a 20th century, I think it was a civil rights course, and we were reading a book called Civil Rights about institutionalized racism in education systems. And one student got so angry at what we were reading about, he just threw the book across the room and it bounced off the wall. And I remember in that moment feeling relief, actually feeling, yes, thank goodness someone is expressing an emotion around this. I don't know how to study this and hold all of this inside my body. I think I ate a lot of ice cream after those classes. What I found, and I'll just wrap up with this, is that generative poetry and sometimes found poetry creates that space to be able to enter the emotions, so then eventually to use some of that as the discussion. And I'm not going to show the sketch, the 19th century sketch that provoked this poem, but I'll just tell you it was of a burned, decimated Native American village with bodies in the foreground. And photography was not used this was pre-Civil War, and so it was a sketch, but it was a very evocative sketch. And one student wrote this: I grew up watching Westerns, cowboy movies we called them. My two fingers in a sideways L. Bang, bang, you're dead. I was 5, 6, 7, 8. Here are the bodies of little boys, 5, 6, 7, 8. Their village in flames, and my two fingers don't know what to say. I really want to have my classroom be a place where there's room for this. And I think poetry is one of the ways that allows us to express, have a place and have a pause to bring all of ourselves to studies and see what that does, how that changes a course, and changing it from just the consumption of material to the recreation of that material and who you are. And with that, I will pass on to Adam, I believe.
Thank you, Nan. I'm just gonna take over the screen sharing here. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about how I'm using poetry in a current book project I'm calling the talk Found in Cemeteries, Holistic Inquiry in Places of the Dead. And just to briefly introduce you to what this project is, it's a study of grassroots efforts in places of the marginalized dead to restore them, reclaim them, tell their stories. And the book project, for the book project, I have a number of research sites. Many of them are African-American historic burial grounds that have fallen victim to what the scholar Zach Mortiz calls perpetual neglect, so structured neglect compared to white and other cemeteries. As well as former mental hospital cemeteries, an architecture of mass institutionalization that occurred in this country that for the most part has been erased, turned into condos, bulldozed, et cetera, and often these abandoned cemeteries are all that's left of them. But today I'm going to talk about just one of my research sites, Mount Moriah Cemetery, because I'm going to highlight some poetry that literally came out from that site. Although I couldn't help, before I move on, sort of sneaking in a couple shots of Geer Cemetery for those who are here in Durham. This is about 2 miles from campus, a really important historic African-American burial ground here in Durham that I've joined the board of the organization that's working to reclaim it and also do community engaged teaching in that space. So that picture on the right has actually a number of Durham Tech students and one of my students from Duke in it. Oops, sorry. So Mount Moriah Cemetery was founded in 1855. It's a vast stretch of green space. It takes up over 200 acres. And it's in a part of southwestern Philadelphia that was once rural. This was a so-called rural cemetery where people would go to, have a pastoral place to visit their dead, picnic, etc. But has since been swallowed by a growing city and is now in a dense and majority low-income neighborhood. Now, it's sometimes called Philadelphia's most democratic burial ground because it has a broad diversity of historical periods and people represented. It has veterans from the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, from the US War in Vietnam, Freemasons, church congregations that were moved there from downtown, a potter's field, which is a mass grave for the indigent and unclaimed dead. And crucially for what I'll present today, it's also for decades been an important burial ground for Black Muslims in Philadelphia. One of the few places that allowed a burial without a vault, according to Muslim burial laws. In 2011, after years of financial decline and sort of decline in the state of the cemetery, the caretakers put a padlock on the gates of the cemetery and walked away with no notice whatsoever. And just to make vivid for you what that means, I've been at a community meeting where a woman who had just buried her 4-month-old son talked about burying him and then coming back a few days later and not being able to get into the cemetery. And she said that if she hadn't planted a wooden stake with a reflector on it to mark the space because they hadn't gotten to put the headstone in yet, that she'd actually not be able to find the place where her son was buried. So Mount Moriah, as I said, is kind of referred to as this legend of being the most democratic burial ground. It has a more complicated history. In 1875, a prominent Black caterer in Philadelphia, Henry Jones, was supposed to be buried there by his wife in a funeral procession who were turned away at the gate. And members of the Cemetery Association had organized to keep out, to keep out an African-American man from being buried in the cemetery. This went to the state Supreme Court and ultimately the Joneses won, but by that time, Henry Jones had been buried in a more friendly, convivial place. He's actually not at Mount Moriah. And the cemetery itself, its state, as many neighbors will say, feels of a piece with Cobbs Creek Parkway, the nearby road that's in very bad shape, and with just generally Philadelphia's patterns of kind of gentrification and then zones of social abandonment that skew very much Black and brown. So what brought me to poetry in this very serious project? I have to quote my student Olivia, who is, I hope, still on the call with us today, expressing, I think, some things that Nan and Kali have already, and others, on this, at this meeting have already said, but I love that she expressed it in a poem in her work for me. She said, "Employing poetry to express my research can make people feel my research, not just know it. Feeling is what provokes people to take action. So isn't feeling the most important product of my research?" So as somebody who's been, I think, taught and certainly trained in grad school to valorize concepts maybe more than I should, but whose scholarship, especially in this book, is really, is actually really about relationships, poetry's been really helpful. And so I want to talk a little bit about the relationships that are at the heart of this project. One is between volunteers in these cemeteries that they get up on, a Saturday morning and go out and get poison ivy and, work up a sweat in. Another is between volunteers and the descendants of the people buried in the cemeteries. The volunteers and the dead, and there's a lot of different ways of relating there, whether you're clearing the weeds off a particular site, helping the descendants, find their dead, or doing research on the life histories. There are volunteers in relationship with each other, and really a lot of my book is about how many tensions and complex kind of negotiations arise when people who all want to reclaim a cemetery, but do so through different lenses and with what I call different ways of knowing a cemetery, actually encounter each other and have to work through, where do you start? What's the plan? What does it mean to reclaim an abandoned space? Then there are the complexities of my own relationship to all of the above, especially given the predominance of African-American burial grounds and mental hospital cemeteries in my work. There's me as a white researcher, as somebody who doesn't identify as disabled, though I do have a disabled child and disabled institutionalized people in my family. So all those complexities of, of identity and difference and privilege. What is this book project? How do these cemeteries relate to one another? They all have, in some ways, similar patterns of structured neglect that impact them. They're in my book because they have groups of volunteers working to restore and reclaim them. But also, of course, each one has very much its own story and important differences. And then there's something I didn't necessarily expect to have to write about as much as I have. And I'll say something in a moment about why. There's the relationship between this project on neglected cemeteries and the other spaces I've studied. So my first book and much of my research until recently was on the forensic scientists who investigate mass graves after genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, and kind of was rooted in the study of mass graves. And part of the reason I should say I've had to really think through the relationship between my former work and this project is that I applied for a fellowship and I got this very interesting review from an anonymous peer reviewer who challenged me precisely on sort of the relationship of this project to the previous one. So I put I found poetry really helpful here, and I put the reviewer's words into a found poem. Reviewer number 4 said, on pressing concerns. The earlier book, Digging for the Disappeared, was a contribution to the human rights movement of the last few decades. The new book seems to me less urgent, less focused on pressing concerns of our moment. I take the new book to be largely an addendum to the earlier one. So that's my found poem, and then my generated poem in response is I said, one day in Richmond. One day in Richmond, a young couple drove up to the cemetery. He pulled a mower out of the trunk. She was quiet as he began to mow a plot, moving on from there to the others nearby. This is who makes it a place of human rights, this place we called abandoned. They bring mowers, clippers, a plastic wreath, and they have been here all along, with their dignity, their rights, in the company of their dead. So this kind of pair of poems and some other related writing I've done have been a chance for me to have an actual dialogue in a weird academic process where I was delivered these comments and had no way to have a conversation to even know who'd made them. To really use these words, even when they're critical, even when I maybe needed a few days just to get over my wounds, to be in dialogue with this reviewer. But I want to move back to the question of relationship with interviewees. So Nan said earlier that poetry creates space. And I think she gave us a really beautiful metaphor for thinking about what it does in the community of a classroom. I'm going to be so much more literal for a second and say that in the making of my own manuscript, poetry makes space. In terms of how I want to relate to my interviewees' words, I find something really wonderful about the fact that a lot of my writing, for the most part, is appearing in these long blocks of classic prose that we academics seem to produce so much of. And then an interview comes along, and when I have used poetic inquiry for it, this negative space opens up. And it occupies it luxuriates over the page in a way that I feel, in some very subtle way, kind of corrects or at least speaks to a power relationship between me and my interviewees. And I want to highlight that now because the interviewees whose words I'm about to share with you from Mount Moriah Cemetery have experienced many kinds of violence, as you'll see in this found poem I'm going to show you. They lost their son to a violent altercation with the police in Philadelphia, and then had the added indignity of Mount Moriah being shut down, abandoned, overgrown. And then as I work with my, my transcript of the interview, there's this small added violence that because my interviewees speak Black English, Microsoft Word or whatever word processor I'm using keeps squiggling under it in red and trying to tell this white researcher that I need to fix that their words are wrong. Now, obviously, in what I've just told you, there's so much that can't be repaired, and so much that my scholarship, let's be honest, is extremely small in comparison to. But going back to what Shannon Matern said in the teaching exercise I shared about care and repair, it does feel somehow meaningful that at the very least, when I put their words on the page, I can give them that kind of space and prominence that I spoke to. It feels in some very small way like a form of care for their words, a care that they deserve. So let me share the story of Naji and Inez Muhammad. I made a pathway, Naji and Inez Muhammad. Naji, I used my residential lawnmower. I just made a pathway to where my son's remains, the remains of my son. I made a pathway, and I made it not just in a small section. I did a big whole section there. But it was only maybe 2 years later I realized that it was abandoned, and I couldn't really recognize this area at all. I thought it was at the wrong place. Every now and then you'll see someone will come and just do their loved one, just a small portion, and that's it. And I said, wow, you got to do better than that. I've just been doing the whole thing. Inez, a lot of us have lost our sons to the street violence, and a lot of them are laid here. So it holds a special place to a lot of parents that went through that. The neighbors, they really admire Naji, because can you imagine getting on your deck and seeing this thing full with weeds? It was past our heads. All the people that could not find their loved ones, now they come up, and I just saw a rose on someone's grave. Before, they wasn't even able to do that. And sometimes we come up here and it's balloons, because they put balloons out on their loved ones' birthdays or teddy bears, and they were not able to acknowledge their loved ones before. Naji. So people is constantly trying to find loved ones. Some of them don't know where their loved one's at, and they're still getting headstones. That one is new with the flowers. That one, new. That one over here, that one is new. That one all the way over there with the blue, that's new. She had got that last year. That's new. Inez, isn't that the one that couldn't find her son? I think that's the one. Naji, there's a lot of other cemeteries like this. Somehow it seemed like people don't really care about dead people. They don't. After you're gone, man, you're just forgotten. They'll just think about you every now and then, and that's it. The living have to actually give them that respect. And that's what I've been doing for the remains of my son and for the whole cemetery. Springtime come again. I'll be right at it again. So I want to end by saying that the last relationship that I've really had to work through, and this is very much to go back to Olivia's words, something I've had to feel, not know, is my own relationship with the gravelessness of my family tree and some places of the dead that feel lost to me. So on your right, you'll see a portrait of my grandfather who died when I was 15. And he was a Holocaust survivor who lost his first wife and his 7-year-old daughter, Mira, in the liquidation of the Lodz ghetto. And then he survived because he could engrave. And so he was in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany, put to work as an engraver. And for my grandfather, as well as my grandmother, whose parents and siblings were all killed, there are no graves in Poland. There's only ash from gas chambers and perhaps secret graves in Polish cemeteries that will never be located. But what I remember of my grandfather is our closeness and also the time we spent together in his workshop where he engraved and also did woodwork. So this is a poem that I've used to sort of, I guess, feel my way into the research I'm doing. Workshop. Down the steps, past the laundry room, lemon and electricity scent, past the black and white swivel chair, and the temptation of Grandpa David's violin, to the darkest part of the house where it is always cool. Smell of motor oil, wood glue, metal, smell of things he knows how to do and I don't, never will. If it is time to eat, as it is so often here, if the cousins arrive, if it's time for a bath, for the nicer clothes we wear on holidays, even when we're not going to temple, I must go up to it. It doesn't come down here to the workshop. I am 42, writing this book in a house full of people who can't go to work or school, moving my computer and books from dining table to office to front porch to insomnia on the downstairs sofa at night. But where I want to write this is in his workshop, in a house that's gone now, sold and scraped, made someone else's. A workshop like a cabinet of wonders, like a secret, and also like a missing grave. Thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Kali.
Thank you, Adam. Wow, I kind of just want to be still for a while. Yeah. Well, all right, my friends, can you see found in transcripts on your screen okay? All right. Thumbs up if you, Nan, if you can see found in transcripts on the screen. Great, okay. Well, Nan and Adam have both brought up strands that I hope you'll hear as well in my work. I largely rely on interviews for my research. My current project is on the writing lives of adult HBCU students. And I was Humanities Unbound scholar at Duke last year, where I was afforded time to interview 30 people who are current students at NCCU. That's North Carolina Central University, if you're from out of town. And when I was in the process of the last rounds of interviews, I started practicing poetic inquiry, and I can't even remember what got me started in it, but it felt really necessary. So my main practice is to use poetry as a form of very close listening. And what I found that I was doing is that I had a subset of 6 people who agreed to case study interview sets of 3. And I was in the process of re-listening and rereading the first round of interviews before setting up second interviews. And I found myself pausing and noticing hot spots where I wanted to delve a little deeper before scheduling our next interviews. And those hot spots for me called forth the possibility of writing poems from them. My goal there was to really listen closely, to be slow about this, and to just ask that question of, what's here? What is this person trying to tell me? What started happening was this preliminary set of themes started popping out. And I also, as Adam mentioned, these connections of between concepts and relationships. I feel like I was doing what I was supposed to do as a researcher. I was trained to hear themes. I was trained to, do analysis and do coding. And so the fact that themes started popping up felt like, oh, good research practice. But the more satisfying aspect truly is that it helped me feel reconnected to the people who had donated their time and their wisdom to my research project. Of course, as Adam and Nan have both mentioned, we 3 are white researchers, and not all of our projects are about white people. And most of the participants in my study are African American. And so I always maintain this concern on my shoulder of taking care around appropriation of other people's wisdom, taking real deep care about misrepresentation, especially people of cultural differences from me, because I can't necessarily hear exactly what's there really because of our differences. So how I've been dealing with this as a researcher is to invite attribution. Most of the people on my current study have say they prefer to have their names associated with their words. Their words belong to them, their insights belong to them. I have also turned to listening more closely, listening more than once. I share poems with participants, and I also involve students at NCCU as research partners, and some of them are here today. And I write more poems. So I'll just share with you one poem that came from an interview with Gregory Weaver II. He's a man in his 20s. And I talked to him during his senior year. My great-grandma, when we were driving, she would make me read street signs. She didn't learn how to read till she was in like her 30s. So she knew if there's one thing you need to know how to do, it's read and write. You need to know how to tell people who you are and what you're not. So this was one of a series of poems that I wrote from a really, really rich interview that Greg gave to me that really sensitized me to the theme of kind of cultural identity that comes from literacy practices and denial of literacy, and like this you need to know how to tell people who you are and what you're not. I stayed with that line a lot longer than I think I would have if I were simply doing my traditional, more social sciencey methods of coding. And what's happened as a result for me of taking care with poems is learning to listen for themes that I pick up then in other people's transcripts and savor and play with and work with and develop more poems. I think I probably have a set of 20 poems at this point from listening really carefully. And then more recently, I was able to move from the themes that the participants shared with me to developing a chapter outline. And so you'll see in this outline that the words of participants title the chapter. So everything in red here on the record, that came from working with another poem, came directly from the language of my participants. I turned them into stories that this signaled to me, this is one of the poems that signaled to me that I was not looking for this. I didn't want to see this, but this is a fact that my participants were telling me, that they use writing to rewrite traumatic experience, to regenerate after the fact of traumatic experience, to face traumatic experience. And so this was one of the lines that came from one of the participants who pointed me in a direction I didn't want to go, but I couldn't ignore because I was, listening carefully. A subset of participants, so the 30 folks who joined me on this adventure as participants range in age from 25 to late 50s. And some of them have significant experience with writing and reading in workplaces. So one of the cool things that I came across and started comparing across different experienced writers with workplace experiences is this negotiation of ownership of their own writing, who it belongs to. Is it corporate? Where's my voice? And so one of my participants, this is a line, other people are going to touch it, he was acknowledging that, this doesn't really completely belong to him, even though he takes ownership over the ethics. And then I had another awesome participant who was explaining to me about her experience of becoming, having never, ever been to any play except her son's. When he was 7, she went to a play, and then she comes to NCCU as an older student and with a lot of background in the medical field, wasn't sure what she wanted to major in, and she fell in love with theater, but it was so hard and so different, right? And so one of the things she talked about was writing her way into academic belonging and questioning about academic belonging. She said, I need to figure out what this is. And she was talking about theater. Do I fit here? And so these are my participants helped me write my way into a book. And I've never written a book before, but they gave me so much material and were so generous with their insights that I'm going to write this book called, and it's tentatively titled Braided Literacies, right? The Writing Lives of Adult Students at a Historically Black University. I question always, and I continue to question my right to write this. And when I come back around to my responsibility to write this is because I promised the participants that I would work with their language and their insights and make sure that it was amplified and broadcast. So I took a page from Nan's process of of like using generative and now Adam's process of using generative poetry. And just last week I thought, well, let me think about this in poems with your words. I sit with your words so close, we are almost touching. You have gone on to other things long ago, but I am here now with you, with the residue of our conversation, sifting it, every word, as if we had talked for hours, not minutes, about that one thing, that one moment in your life, slow, on repeat, re-listening. What's here? What do I hear? The lines and what's between them. So, that's my story. I love this quote that Nan found for us, right? The use of poetry in qualitative research has taken root across many disciplines. It encompasses a form of work that includes much more than experimental writing and the production of poetry. It is an artful way of being a researcher. So, what questions do you have? What comments do you have? Oh, these are sweet comments. This is lovely.
Maybe we can turn off the screen share now, Kali, so that as we have conversation, we can see people's faces.
Definitely.
I wanted to thank you. Is it time for comments or questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Kali so much, and Nan and Adam. This is also interesting. First of all, I'll say this, that I approach all this with the East-West sensibility. So I'm looking at what Adam said about experiencing something as opposed to knowing something. And Nan, you talked about this whole sense of the emotional life, that I actually got to talk about my feelings, not just the analysis and so on. And I've been thinking about my students at NCCU and elsewhere, having been raised in the eastern part of the world and lived half my life in many cultures here and there. It's a very, in terms of cultural differences, the language, of course, becomes so important that within the country, when I teach composition here, I've actually had my students make their journal entries in poetry or prose. And some of my students who are really very weak in grammar and punctuation are excellent poets when it comes to writing. So I had them write a reflective essay, which was, the topic was, who am I and where do I belong? And many wrote that no English teacher had ever asked them, said, do you want me to write about myself? Well, I said, this is reflective writing. Yes. And so they had been used to being in English classes where it was very prescriptive. You do this, you don't do that. You control your emotions, you don't. And so that has always been difficult for me. And so, coming to this workshop has been very helpful in understanding the perspective about coding and analysis and all that. I get it. But the loss of the rich emotional life, growing up in India, it was a very rich emotional life. African countries, it's a very rich emotional life. So I guess post-Enlightenment in Europe, there is a loss of one, but then the need to strike this balance, which is so much a part of us. So when you talk of, when I think of creativity, I think of language. That is the source of creativity, and even storytelling. Who's the storyteller and where you are. So this is so enriching, and it is so helpful. And particularly at this moment in time, we're looking at differences across cultures. One could be the emotional and the rational, and has one suppressed the other way too much when it comes to research and academia. But how about people who are just going through different courses to feel honored and have the space to express their feelings. And then get to the stage when, so I tell my students, well, you're the ones who are thinking and feeling. I'm just here to, facilitate, like a child grows up naturally. You just make sure you don't fall down and break your head. So you have the ideas. I'm just here to help you communicate, but never forget that we are human beings. And so when we lose that, it's a terrible loss. So I guess all our speakers today are kind of putting back the heart where it belongs. And I thank you for this. I've enjoyed it. So what I considered natural later became like, what is the problem? And so I'm beginning to understand that better and better. Though I've been in, different contexts. So I've gone on too long, I think.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Carly and Nan and Adam. Yeah.
We've got some questions in the chat. Shall we? I'd like to ask folks to unmute. Nicole, you had a question about, have you ever had any resistance from students when you ask them to write poetry of their own? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm just curious about how it looks in the classroom when you're having students write. I was really moved by all of your examples. And I guess it kind of goes along with Lori's question, and in a way it responds to Kuldeep Kami's reflections on the Enlightenment and the removal of the experience from the white people of the world. But how to create a kind of safety, especially if a poem is asking students to be very vulnerable with their own personal experiences. I think Adam had mentioned at one point in the first hour about using like a sandbox slide deck where students can contribute anonymously, just those issues.
Yeah.
I can address part of that if you want, and then pass it along. So resistance, definitely. What's surprising, and that's a lot why I structured that first part around, you don't have to worry about this or this or this. But what's surprising is I didn't really want to take time in my classes to do an English class on poetry and define it. So I just asked people to bring in some poetry they enjoyed. And what was very helpful was how many of them brought lyrics. And so the idea of the musicality of that kind of, I mean, supposedly all our writing should have musicality and wonderful rhythms, but poetry, I think for me, it's a little easier to get there. And by the end of the class sharing the variety and their joy and what they loved about it, we'd answered that question of what will we be writing as our, it had taken down the walls somehow. So rather than erasing the resistance by defining it, we actually undefined it. We deconstructed, and that seemed to help. And just the one other thing I'll throw in around safety is a lot of times I'll say, if all you want to share of this is a word or a phrase of it or a first line, and it is rare that someone doesn't want some piece of it out there spoken in the circle. I don't know that I've ever had a student that didn't at least want one word, to hear themselves. So that seems to just help on those things.
Lori, you had asked a question related to Nicole's and she kind of stitched it in, but if you want to unmute and get more explanation of what you're asking about, please feel free to.
Yeah, that gave me 3 strategies to consider. And I think it's more the initial, I really love this as an idea to bring greater intimacy, especially because we're healthcare providers, the students I'm teaching, but at the same time, they come with kind of this, some come with a really athlete's kind of straightforward, practical approach to the content. And so I see this as a really nice bridge, and those 3 strategies are really helpful to me. I'm wondering about strategies to have students share that, because I see this also as a way to build in an appreciation of diversity and the culture that your patients are coming from that Kuldip brought into it. And so I'm wondering if I pose this as an activity in class, ways to encourage sharing without putting people on the spot. And you know, how, because often when I do kind of go into things like this, there's a quietness, and I just usually outweight the quietness. But are there other strategies that would make it a safer place? And I've also used my own response to the activity to try to break that ice a little bit. But any other ideas that you have for me to kind of encourage sharing with that feels safe and not pushy?
Adam, do you want to take that?
Sure. I have a couple thoughts. I mean, so one is the sort of approach which Nan just mentioned of default to anonymity and then give students control over what they share.
That's good.
And I think that works. Obviously, we've just sort of shown you one way to do that via Zoom with a slide deck. It can also work, I'd much rather, technology-wise, I'd much rather be dealing with a whiteboard and a table. So imagining that reality coming back, like, write the poem in your notebook and then give people 5 minutes, anything you want to share from your poem, you can write up and mark around the whiteboard, and then we'll all take a look and discuss. But, kind of separating a public and a private space. I think that another thing that's that might work for this is in the class I'm teaching right now, I have the students divided into research support teams, where there's 3 of them or 4 of them, and all semester long, they're sharing stages of their project. And I could picture, giving the students, again, nobody has to share anything that they don't want to, but also giving students a space within a space of a more trusted, more intimate group. But the last thing I would say about like using poetic inquiry is that I don't think it's a solution to everything, but I think often as teachers, we experience problems at both ends, or I shouldn't even frame them as problems. We experience dilemmas at both ends. One is students, wanting to be sure students feel safe, wanting to be sure that they're not having to, talk about their own trauma or without wanting to and things like that. And then at the other end, there's, especially once they're deep into a research project, there's that time you get to where often students feel like they're spitting back a whole bunch of citations and they've lost somehow, they've gotten this pile of books and articles, but somehow their voice has gotten completely lost. And let's be honest, they feel like they have all these experts, with PhDs or whatever, sitting next to them, and their voice doesn't even feel worthy, right? So the poem that I shared, the little excerpt that I shared from Olivia's poem, actually came from an exercise where with a bunch of key sources, I said, write a poem in the format, they say, I say, they say, I say, and just alternate your stanzas. And so way at the other end of those other dilemmas of when you lose students' voice, even when they want it to be there, I found poetic inquiry really powerful at just giving them, and the stuff, I wish I could just share, 20 of these poems, but the stuff they've written is so beautiful. And really all that template does is it reminds them the reason I'm reading this source is to be in conversation with it. And I'm in charge of that conversation.
Yeah.
If I can quickly hop onto that, because Adam is also a cartoonist. And one of the ways I do that kind of same exercise especially when they're going to write something where their argument may counter another's, or and they're dealing with the language, okay, how do I negotiate this? And I love to have them write the cartoon of themselves and the scholar, however they imagine them, or maybe they do some research, and it I don't know, brings them down. It puts it more an equal playing, an exchange of ideas rather than they're up here and I'm down here.
Yeah.
So.
And
I want to make sure that we get to Jess's great question. She's been waiting, and it's a really excellent question. Jess, can you unmute and talk us through your concerns?
Yeah, sure. And I say this in part because, like, from personal experience, I'm just starting my dissertation this year. I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate. Yeah, thank you. I had a sort of weird experience, partly in my exams. At one point, I was told that I was too emotionally earnest and to consider being less so. And it was from people that I wouldn't necessarily like expect that critique from. And I think in light of that, I think it's really refreshing to hear people talking about emotion and its role within scholarship, and not sort of reinvesting in that binary thinking where like affect is on one hand and like scholarship is on the other. But I wondered if you had, you know, smarter things than that to say about the importance of emotion, and whether sort of emotion can coexist with academic rigor, and how to sort of straddle those both.
I'll take this for now, right? Pass the baton. I think, you know, I'm excited about how Adam's actually weaving the poetry into his scholarship. I'd say, Jess, that this is part of the, like, maintaining your passion for your work, you know, is like staying in touch with your heart. Nobody gets through a dissertation without loving the subject. You know, I suppose some people do, you know, people who are tougher than I am. But if you don't love your subject and have really strong feelings about it, if you're not angry, or, you know, and what, you know, if you don't like this,
Right.
I just don't see how you can maintain a project for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, unless you have like really strong feelings about it that aren't loathing.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
at the very least, the generative poems that Nan and Adam and I kind of turn to kind of deal with, oh my God, an abundance of feeling, let's just go there, or whatever that feeling is, will help you, I think, in the practice of managing that pushback, that objectivity, that, you know, the scholarly, some of the scholarly world's just privileging so much that distance, right? So, but I'm really happy to tell you that you can use both in the same day, with the same text, with the same thing,
Right.
that they're not divorced. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Nan or Adam who want to add.
How about this this line from a poem? To think the feeling of a rose. It's a famous one, but was used for, you know, the dissociational sensibility that came beyond John Donne's writing. But that there was a time when the two were very together, the feeling and the thinking, and so the need to bring back that balance. But anyway, on a very quick note, that to answer Beth, I think she's not there, that writing is self-discovery, that just the act of writing is an act of self-discovery, and writing as therapy, writing as healing. Put it down there and the solutions come, and go on from there. So just a few thoughts like that.
I think right now I am experimenting with pulling that in. So I've used poetic inquiry. So right now I have for a while been researching a singer from the 1840s and 50s, Mother Cherokee, father Black slave from Mississippi. And at a certain point, as Kali shared, there was the question of, am I sure I can tell this story? Am I sure I should tell this story? And I was using poetic inquiry, and then it did morph into a conversation where she talked back to me. Now I know it was still me, but let me tell you, she was she was tough. And I learned so much. And I actually, right now, I don't know if I'll have the courage to go through this. I'm incorporating that in. That's going to be threaded through. And I know that a publisher will want to have some good foundation of, okay, the scholarly, but I've had students published with essays with the poetry woven in, kind of like a, what was that, marble ice cream where that was like woven in there, you know? So yeah, it's scary though. It doesn't feel as safe, but it's so, as Kali was saying, I am so much more jazzed writing this now.
Oh my goodness. It is past 3 and there's still some questions in the chat. Should we just maybe put our emails in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go ahead and do that. And we, all three of us, welcome you to reach out if you've got things that feel unsettled and want to have some more conversation around holistic inquiry. We have so enjoyed the process of creating this and so enjoyed having you all here with us today. You've been a fantastic group of people, so upbeat.
Yeah,
So
thank
willing.
you to all of you. It's been really a privilege and a pleasure.
And
Mhm.
so
Thank you
talented.
so much.
I
yeah.
wish we had time to read through all of the, yeah, so that sandbox, man, there's some gorgeous castles in there.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much. Yeah.
Tina.
Take care.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Toby. I love Anne, fun not grading.
That's such a